December 15, 1944. When 473 German prisoners stepped off the USS General William Mitchell in Boston Harbor, they expected torture camps, starvation, and execution. Dietrich Brenner, a 23-year-old baker's son from Munich, had spent the voyage listening to rumors about what Americans did to prisoners. 6 months later, he would weigh 35 pounds more, question everything the Third Reich had taught him, and face a choice that would change his life forever. But first, he had to survive the crossing. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. The engine of the USS General William Mitchell thrummed through the metal hull like a mechanical heartbeat, steady and relentless. In the cramped hold below deck, Dietrich Brenner pressed his face against the cold steel wall and tried to imagine what waited on the other side of the Atlantic. The rumors had started 3 days into the voyage. Whispered in German passed from bunk to bunk in the darkness. The Americans had special camps, some said, not for holding prisoners, but for eliminating them. Industrial facilities where men disappeared into furnaces, their ashes scattered into the ocean. Others claimed the torture was slower. Starvation rations, forced labor until your body gave out, medical experiments conducted without anesthesia. Dietrich had learned to recognize the difference between fear and truth during his 18 months as a prisoner of war. But here in the belly of this ship, with the ocean pressing in from all sides and the future completely unknown, the distinction blurred. He was 23 years old. He had been a soldier for 4 years and a prisoner for 1.5. He could no longer remember what it felt like to be simply Dietrich, the baker's son from Munich, who woke at 4 in the morning to the smell of yeast and flour. That life belonged to someone else now. Someone who had existed before the war taught him that the world was made of ash and iron and blood. Beside him in the cramped space, Wilhelm Hartmann sat with his back against the bulkhead, a battered English phrasebook open on his lap. Hartmann was 37, a schoolteacher from Dresden with wire-rimmed glasses and the kind of patient, measured voice that made even the youngest prisoners listen when he spoke. He had been captured during the Italian campaign, plucked from a field hospital where he'd been recovering from shrapnel wounds that had left his left leg stiff and aching in cold weather. Now he practiced English pronunciation, moving his lips silently as he traced the words with one finger. Hartmann believed that knowledge was a form of resistance, that understanding your captors gave you power, even if that power was only the ability to ask for water in a language they understood. On Dietrich's other side, Lucas Zimmermann sprawled across his bunk with the careless confidence of someone too young to truly believe in his own mortality. Lucas was 18, barely old enough to shave, with a sharp face and restless hands that were never still. He'd been captured in France, separated from his unit during the chaos of the Allied advance, and he talked constantly about escape, about stealing a boat and sailing back across the Atlantic, about overpowering the guards and taking control of the ship. The other prisoners tolerated his bravado because they understood what it really was: fear dressed up in the language of defiance. Dietrich closed his eyes and let the engine's rhythm carry him backward through memory, to the bakery in Munich, to his father's hands, strong and flour-dusted, shaping dough with the kind of practiced precision that came from 40 years of rising before dawn. His father had taught him that bread was a conversation between the baker and the ingredients. You had to listen to the dough feel when it needed more water, more time, more warmth. You couldn't force it. You could only guide it toward becoming what it was meant to be. He wondered if his father was still alive, if the bakery still stood, or if it had been reduced to rubble by Allied bombs. The last letter he'd received 8 months ago in the English camp had been brief and carefully worded. His mother wrote that food was scarce, but they were managing, that they thought of him every day, that they prayed he would come home safe. She hadn't mentioned the bombing raids, hadn't described the queues for ration cards or the constant fear that pressed down on German cities like a physical weight. But Dietrich could read the spaces between her words, could feel the exhaustion in the way her handwriting slanted across the page, growing smaller and more cramped, as if she were trying to conserve the paper itself. The ship rolled slightly, and somewhere in the hold a man retched into a bucket. The smell of vomit mixed with unwashed bodies and diesel fuel. They had been at sea for 8 days. 8 days of cold metal and stale air and the constant low-grade nausea that came from being trapped below deck with no horizon to fix your eyes on. Hartman looked up from his phrase book. In the dim light, his glasses reflected the single bare bulb that swung from the ceiling with each swell. "They told me we're going to a place called Vermont," he said quietly in German. His voice had the flat, careful quality of a man testing dangerous information. "Have you heard of it?" Dietrich shook his head. American geography was a blank space in his education. He knew there was New York, where the tall buildings scraped the sky, Chicago, where gangsters ruled the streets, California, where Hollywood manufactured its dreams. But Vermont meant nothing to him. "It's in the north," Hartman continued. "Mountains, forests. The guards say it's beautiful." He paused, adjusting his glasses with one finger. "They say the camp is different from the ones in England, smaller, more isolated." Lucas snorted from his bunk. "Of course they say that. They want us relaxed, easier to control prisoners who think they're going somewhere pleasant." He sat up, his voice rising with the particular kind of aggressive certainty that young men use to mask uncertainty. "My brother was captured by the Russians. You know what happened to him. They worked him to death in Siberia, froze solid in a ditch, and the guards just left him there. That's what happens to prisoners. That's what's waiting for us, no matter what these American bastards say about Vermont and mountains and beauty." The hold fell silent. Several men had stopped their own conversations to listen. In the enclosed space, words carried weight. They could lift spirits or crush them, and right now morale was a fragile thing held together by nothing more than the human instinct to hope, even when hope seemed foolish. Hartman closed his phrase book carefully. When he spoke, his voice was gentle but firm. The teacher's voice correcting a student without shaming him. "Your brother was captured by the Russians," he said. "We were captured by the British, and now we're in American custody. These are not the same thing, Lucas. You know this." "They're all the enemy," Lucas shot back. "You think it matters what flag they fly? They want us dead. All of us. And they'll find slower ways to do it than bullets, that's all." Dietrich opened his eyes. He was tired of Lucas's fear masquerading as anger, tired of the endless speculation about what waited ahead. But he was also tired of his own uncertainty, the way it gnawed at him in the quiet hours, making him question every assumption he'd built his understanding on. "The British didn't kill us," he said quietly. 18 months in their camps and they fed us. Not well, but adequately. They followed the Geneva Convention. They treated us like prisoners of war, not like animals." "Barely," Lucas muttered. "Those rations were garbage. Thin soup and stale bread." "But it was food," Hartman interjected. "Regular food. Medical care when we needed it. Letters from home even if they took months to arrive. These are not the actions of people planning to exterminate us." Lucas opened his mouth to argue, then seemed to think better of it. He turned his face to the wall, his shoulders tight with the kind of tension that had nowhere to go. The ship's horn sounded long and low. A ripple of movement went through the hold as men sat up, exchanged glances, tried to read meaning into the sound. Were they approaching land? Was this the moment when everything changed? Dietrich's heart kicked against his ribs. He realized his hands were shaking and he pressed them flat against his thighs, willing them to stillness. Whatever was coming, he would face it with dignity. That much he could control. The fear, the uncertainty, the way his stomach twisted itself into knots, those were involuntary. But how he carried himself, how he met whatever waited on the other side of this voyage, that was his choice. The phrase his father used to repeat came back to him now, unbidden. "You can't control the heat of the oven, son. You can only control what you put into it and how long you let it bake." His father had been talking about bread, but the principle held for other things too, for survival, for maintaining your humanity when everything around you was designed to strip it away. The engines changed pitch. The ship was slowing. Around him, 473 German prisoners held their breath and waited to see what America had in store for them. The morning they docked in Boston Harbor, the sky pressed down like a sheet of hammered steel grey and featureless and cold. Dietrich shuffled down the gangway with the other prisoners, his legs unsteady after 8 days at sea, his breath forming clouds in the December air. The guards positioned themselves at intervals along the dock rifles, held loosely, but ready, their faces showing neither hostility nor sympathy. Just the blank professional watchfulness of men doing a job they'd done many times before. What struck Dietrich first, what hit him with enough force to make him stumble on the gangway, was how well-fed the American soldiers looked. Their uniforms were new, or at least well-maintained, with sharp creases and polished buttons. Their faces were full, not hollowed out by hunger. They carried themselves with a casual confidence that spoke of adequate sleep, regular meals, and the kind of physical strength that came from a body that wasn't constantly operating at the edge of depletion. One guard, a young man with red hair and freckles, was actually chewing gum. The sight of it, the casual waste of calories on something that provided no nutrition, was so shocking that Dietrich stopped walking entirely. The guard noticed his stare and grinned, snapping his gum loudly. Then he turned to say something to another soldier, and they both laughed. Dietrich felt something crack inside his understanding of the world. Not break, not yet, but crack. The first hairline fracture in the wall of certainty the propaganda had built in his mind. If America was weak, starving, on the verge of economic collapse, if the war was bankrupting them as the German newspapers had insisted then, why did their soldiers look like they'd never missed a meal in their lives? Why were their uniforms new instead of patched and repatched? Why did they have the energy to laugh and joke while performing guard duty on a cold December morning? They were loaded onto trucks, 40 men to a vehicle, and driven through the streets of Boston. Dietrich pressed his face to the gap in the canvas covering and watched the city pass. What he saw made the crack in his understanding spread wider. Buildings stood intact, not a crater in sight, no rubble-filled lots, no hollow-eyed civilians picking through ruins. Shop windows displayed goods, actual consumer goods, not just empty space or propaganda posters. He saw a woman in a red coat walking with shopping bags in both hands. Saw automobiles moving through the streets, not horse-drawn carts or bicycles. Saw electric lights burning even though it was daytime, a casual abundance of power that seemed impossible given what he'd been told about American industrial weakness. Hartman, squeezed in beside him, was seeing the same things. Their eyes met, and in that moment, no words were necessary. They were both thinking the same thing. If this was what the enemy looked like, prosperous, intact, functioning, then what had they been fighting for? What had the war cost Germany in blood and suffering in pursuit of victory over a nation that appeared to be thriving? The trucks turned north and began climbing out of the coastal plain. The landscape changed, growing more rural, more forested. White-painted farmhouses dotted the hillsides, each one substantial and well-maintained. Barns that were bigger than most German houses. Church steeples rising from small villages that looked almost European in their arrangement, except for the complete absence of war damage. Snow began to fall light and dry, dusting the fields and trees with a clean whiteness that seemed impossibly peaceful. Dietrich watched it accumulate on fence posts and pine branches and felt a strange dislocation, as if he'd stepped sideways into a world that existed parallel to his own, but operated by different rules. In this world, apparently war was something that happened elsewhere. In this world, children could play in the snow without checking the sky for bombers. In this world, people went about their daily business as if the planet weren't tearing itself apart. The cognitive dissonance was almost painful. This was supposed to be the enemy homeland, the heart of the force that was destroying Germany, city by city, factory by factory. And it looked more prosperous and peaceful than Germany had been even before the war began. Lucas was staring out another gap in the canvas, his face pale and shocked. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost all its bravado. "Where are the bombs?" he whispered. "Where's the destruction? We've been bombing them for years. Where is it?" No one answered. Because the answer was obvious and terrible. Germany's bombing capacity had been broken long ago. These pristine villages, these intact cities, they stood untouched, not because German bombers showed mercy, but because German bombers couldn't reach them anymore. The Luftwaffe that had once terrorized London was now reduced to defending German skies, and failing even at that. The truth was written in the landscape itself. America was untouchable, had always been untouchable, and the war that had consumed Europe, that had turned German cities into moonscapes of rubble and ash, hadn't even scratched the surface of American soil. Hartmann leaned close and whispered in Dietrich's ear, "Look at the farms. Really look at them." Dietrich looked, saw the size of the barns, the quality of the fencing, the sheer scale of the agricultural operations. Even in winter, even with snow beginning to cover the fields, these farms radiated abundance. Storage silos stood full. Equipment sat parked and maintained. Cattle dotted the pastures, healthy and well-fed. He thought about Bavaria, about the farms he'd known as a child, already operating on thin margins before the war, about what 5 years of total mobilization had done to German agriculture, with every able-bodied man drafted and every resource diverted to the war machine. By the time he'd been captured, German civilians were surviving on rations that wouldn't keep a working man functioning. The elderly and the young were slowly starving. And here in the enemy heartland, the barns were bigger than houses. Wilhelm's voice was barely audible. "They lied to us about everything, didn't they?" Before Dietrich could answer, the truck began to slow. They were climbing into mountains now, real mountains with peaks that rose on either side of the valley they followed. In the late afternoon, as winter sun cast long shadows across the snow, the convoy pulled into a small town. A sign read, "Waterbury." The truck stopped at a train station, and the prisoners were ordered out and onto waiting vehicles. They drove 3 miles through increasingly deep snow, following a road that wound between forested slopes. Then the camp came into view. Camp Waterbury sat in a valley surrounded by mountains, a collection of wooden barracks arranged in neat rows and enclosed by wire fencing. Guard towers stood at the corners, but even these seemed less ominous than what Dietrich had expected. The camp looked like what it was, a temporary installation built quickly and without particular malice. Functional but not designed to break spirits. As the trucks passed through the main gate, Dietrich noticed something that made his breath catch in his throat. Outside the fence, local civilians had paused in their activities to watch the arrival. A man in work clothes stood beside a pickup truck holding a toolbox. 2 women with shopping bags had stopped on the sidewalk. A few children on bicycles had pulled over to stare. None of them were jeering. None threw stones or spat or shouted curses. They simply watched with what appeared to be curiosity. One woman, elderly and wrapped in a thick wool coat, actually raised her hand in a small wave. Lucas saw it too. His voice cracked. "Why are they waving? Why don't they hate us?" The truck stopped in the central yard, and the prisoners were ordered to form ranks. The camp commandant emerged from the main building, a solid man in his 50s with greying hair and the bearing of someone who'd done this before. He waited while an interpreter took position beside him, a young private who looked nervous about addressing so many enemy soldiers. "I am Colonel Cyrus Morrison," the commandant said, his voice carrying across the assembled prisoners. The interpreter translated sentence by sentence, his German heavily accented but comprehensible. "You are prisoners of war under the Geneva Convention. You will be treated according to international law. You will work as the convention allows, but you will be paid for your labor. You will receive the same rations as American soldiers. You will have access to medical care. You will be allowed to send and receive mail. If you follow the rules, you will be treated fairly." The prisoners stood in stunned silence. The same rations as American soldiers, payment for work, medical care, mail. These promises seemed too incredible to believe. Surely this was some kind of trick, a temporary kindness before harsher treatment began. Dietrich could feel the disbelief rippling through the assembled men, a collective held breath waiting for the other shoe to drop. But Morrison just stood there, his expression neither cruel nor kind, simply professional, a man stating facts. "You will be assigned to barracks," he continued. 4 men to a room in most cases. You will keep your quarters clean. You will treat the guards and each other with respect. You will work 6 days a week with Sundays free. Your wages will be 80 cents per day in camp script, which you may use at the canteen for personal items. Is this understood?" The interpreter finished translating. 473 men stared at the commandant, trying to process what they'd just been told. 80 cents a day. That was more money than many of them had seen in years. And they were being paid to work, not simply forced into labor. Morrison seemed to understand their confusion. Something that might have been sympathy crossed his face, quickly controlled. "I know you have been told many things about America," he said, "about how we treat prisoners. Some of what you've been told is lies. Some of it may have been true in other places, other circumstances. But here in this camp you will be treated according to the laws of war. I give you my word on that." He paused, letting the interpreter catch up. Then he added, almost as an afterthought, "Welcome to Vermont, gentlemen. I hope your stay with us passes quickly and without incident." Then he turned and walked back into the building, leaving the prisoners to be processed by his staff. They were assigned to barracks, each building housing 40 men in 10 rooms of 4 bunks each. The structures were heated with wood stoves, not luxurious, but far warmer than the unheated tents Dietrich had endured in North Africa, or even the drafty barracks in England. Each prisoner was issued 2 wool blankets, a pillow, basic toiletries and work clothes. The bunks were 2-tiered solid wood construction with thin mattresses that were nevertheless better than sleeping on bare ground. Dietrich found himself assigned to a room with Wilhelm Lucas and a quiet man from Stuttgart named Otto, who'd been a mechanic before the war. They moved through the routine of claiming bunks and stowing their meager possessions in silence, each man lost in his own thoughts, trying to reconcile expectation with reality. Then came dinner. The mess hall was a long building with tables arranged in rows. The prisoners filed through a serving line where American cooks ladled food onto metal trays. When Dietrich reached the front of the line and saw what was being put on his tray, he stopped moving entirely. The man behind him bumped into his back, muttered an apology in German, then fell silent, as he too saw the food. On the tray, a thick beef stew with chunks of meat the size of Dietrich's fist. A mountain of mashed potatoes with a pat of real butter melting in the center. Green beans glistening with more butter. A slice of fresh bread, actual wheat bread, not the sawdust-laced ersatz that had become standard in Germany. A wedge of apple pie. A cup of coffee with real sugar. Dietrich stared at it. This amount of food would have fed his entire family for 2 days in Munich, and this was one meal, for one prisoner, on what was supposed to be a regular day. The smell hit him like a physical force. Salt, smoke, the caramelization of beef fat against hot metal. It was a smell he'd forgotten existed after 18 months of thin soups and stale bread in the English camps. The smell of abundance. The smell of a nation that could afford to feed even its enemies better than their own citizens fed their children. Beneath the beef, other scents layered themselves. Butter's sweet cream richness, mixing with potatoes' earthy steam. Fresh bread yeast, which triggered a cascade of memories so powerful, Dietrich had to close his eyes. Apple pie, cinnamon sugar perfume, impossibly decadent. Real coffee. Not the chicory substitute he'd choked down in Germany when coffee was available at all, but actual coffee beans ground and brewed, bitter and rich and luxurious beyond measure. His hands started shaking. The tray felt heavy, weighted with more than just food. It was weighted with implications, with the collapse of everything he'd been taught about American weakness and German strength, with the terrible understanding that this abundance was normal here, expected routine. Around him, other prisoners had received their trays and stood frozen, staring, unable to process what they were seeing. Some men's eyes filled with tears. Others laughed high and slightly hysterical. A few made the sign of the cross, as if confronted with something miraculous. Wilhelm appeared beside Dietrich, his own tray gripped in white-knuckled hands. He was trembling, and when he spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "This cannot be real. This cannot be what they eat every day." But it was. The proof was right there in front of them, piled on metal trays radiating heat and scent, and the casual certainty of plenty. They found seats at one of the long tables. Dietrich sat down slowly, still staring at his food, as if it might vanish if he looked away. Wilhelm sat across from him, his face pale behind his glasses. Lucas dropped onto the bench beside Dietrich, his earlier bravado completely shattered. For a long moment, none of them moved. The mess hall filled with the sound of men sitting benches, scraping but very little conversation. Just 400 prisoners confronting the first meal they'd received in American custody, trying to understand what it meant. Dietrich picked up his fork. The metal felt solid, substantial, real, not the flimsy tin utensils of the English camps. He cut into the beef stew, watched the meat come apart under pressure, revealing its tender interior, brought the fork to his mouth, hesitated for just a second as if breaking this boundary would change something fundamental, then ate. The taste exploded across his tongue. Salt first, and overwhelming, then fat beef fat, rendered slow and rich, coating every surface of his mouth. Savory depth from hours of cooking, vegetables that had absorbed the meat's essence. And underneath it all, a subtle sweetness from caramelized onions, a complexity that spoke of care in preparation of cooks who took pride in their work, even when cooking for prisoners. He closed his eyes. For a moment, there was nothing else in the world except this taste. No war, no capture, no uncertain future. Just this perfect bite of properly cooked food, the first real meal he'd had in longer than he could remember. When he opened his eyes again, Wilhelm was eating too, his movements slow and deliberate, as if conducting a scientific experiment. Tears ran down his face, but he didn't seem to notice. He was too focused on the food, on processing what his senses were telling him against what his mind had been taught to believe. Lucas, on Dietrich's right, ate with desperate speed, shoveling food into his mouth like a man starving, which in a sense he was. They all were. Not starving for calories, the British had kept them adequately fed, but starving for richness, for flavor, for the kind of meal that reminded you what it felt like to be human instead of just surviving. Dietrich took his time with the potatoes. They were perfectly mashed, smooth and creamy, with enough butter that he could taste its sweetness. Real butter, not margarine, not some chemical substitute. The genuine article used without apparent concern for cost or scarcity. The butter melted on his tongue like warm silk, coating his throat as he swallowed. He thought about his mother, about the last time she'd had access to real butter. Years, probably. Years since any German civilian had been able to buy butter without a ration card and a long wait in line. And here it was given freely to prisoners. The green beans were simple but perfect, still slightly crisp, dressed with more butter and a hint of salt. The bread was revelation, soft and yielding, with a proper crust tasting of wheat instead of sawdust and whatever other fillers had become standard in German bread. He tore off a piece and used it to soak up the gravy from the stew, and the combination of textures and flavors made him want to weep. Then came the apple pie. Dietrich hadn't had dessert in more than 2 years. The first bite was almost overwhelming. The butter crust shattered under pressure, releasing waves of cinnamon sugar perfume. The apples were cooked soft but not mushy, maintaining their structure while giving up their sweetness. Tart sweet with vanilla undertones. And served warm, as if the cooks actually cared about the prisoner's enjoyment. For one perfect moment, Dietrich forgot where he was. Forgot he was a prisoner. Forgot the war. There was only the pie and the way it made him remember what it felt like to be cared for, to be treated as if your comfort and happiness mattered. Then reality crashed back in. He was eating pie while his mother and father, if they were still alive, were subsisting on rations that barely kept body and soul together. He was gaining weight and strength while German civilians grew thinner and weaker. He was being fed by the enemy better than his own government had fed him when he was fighting for the fatherland. The guilt was a physical sensation, heavy and cold in his chest. But he kept eating, because refusing the food wouldn't help his parents, wouldn't end the war, wouldn't change anything except make him weaker. So he ate and felt grateful and felt guilty and felt confused all at the same time. Across the table, Wilhelm had stopped eating. His tray was still half full, but he'd put down his fork and was staring at the remaining food with an expression of profound distress. "I can't," he whispered in German. "I can't eat this much. My body doesn't remember how." Beside Dietrich, Lukas made a choking sound and suddenly stood up, his face gone pale and sweaty. He rushed toward the door, one hand clamped over his mouth. A moment later they heard him retching outside. Several other prisoners had the same reaction. Men who'd eaten too quickly, whose systems couldn't handle the sudden richness after months of deprivation. The guards didn't punish them, just brought buckets and water, their expressions sympathetic. One guard, a young corporal with a Massachusetts accent, said something in English to a prisoner who'd just vomited. The man didn't understand the words, but the tone was clear, gentle, almost apologetic, as if the guard felt bad that the food was too rich, that the prisoners' bodies couldn't process American abundance. Dietrich forced himself to eat slowly, to pace his intake. He didn't finish everything on his tray, couldn't manage it. But he ate more than half, which was more food than he'd seen in a single meal since before the war. When he finally put down his fork, his stomach felt uncomfortably full, but his mind was racing, trying to process the implications of what he'd just experienced. A guard walked through the mess hall, pausing at each table. He was the same corporal who'd been kind to the sick prisoners. When he reached their table, he spoke in halting, heavily accented German. "Tomorrow, same food. Every day, same. You understand?" Wilhelm looked up at him, his eyes red behind his glasses. "Every day. This is the standard ration." The corporal nodded. "Yes, standard. For soldiers, for prisoners, same. Geneva Convention." He pronounced it carefully, as if he'd practiced the words. Then he added in English, but with gestures that made the meaning clear. "You are not the enemy. Your leaders are the enemy. You are just soldiers. We treat soldiers with respect." Then he moved on to the next table, repeating the same message. Dietrich sat in the now quiet mess hall and felt something fundamental shift in his understanding of the world. The propaganda had been clear and constant. America was weak, decadent, on the verge of economic collapse. Its people were soft, unable to fight their industrial capacity, broken by internal divisions. The German forces were superior in every way, destined for victory because of their strength and discipline. Yet here was evidence that contradicted every element of that narrative: the abundance, the organization, the casual efficiency of American operations, the well-fed soldiers, the intact cities, the functioning infrastructure, the ability to feed prisoners as well as their own troops without apparent strain or sacrifice. If this was weakness, what did strength look like? And if Germany was so superior, why were German civilians starving while American prisoners ate beef and pie? The questions hurt. They felt like betrayal, not of Germany but of himself, of all the things he'd believed and fought for. It was easier to believe the propaganda when you never saw the enemy up close. Easier to accept that your suffering served some greater purpose when you didn't have to confront evidence that maybe, just maybe, you'd been lied to from the very beginning. That night, lying in his bunk with a full stomach for the first time in years, warm under 2 wool blankets, while wind howled outside and snow piled up against the barracks, Dietrich stared at the ceiling and tried to reconcile what he knew with what he'd experienced. The barracks were quiet, except for the creak of bunks and the occasional cough. Outside, the mountain wind made the building's frame settle and groan. But inside, it was warm. Not comfortable exactly, but livable. Human. Above him in the upper bunk, Wilhelm was awake too. Dietrich could tell by the quality of his breathing, the way he shifted position every few minutes. "I've been thinking," Wilhelm said finally, his voice barely audible in the darkness. "About what we were taught. About the Jews, the Slavs, all the peoples we were told were inferior. Untermensch. Less than human." He paused. Dietrich waited, knowing Wilhelm was working through something important, something dangerous to say out loud, even in the safety of their own barracks. "If they could lie to us about America," Wilhelm continued, "about something we could verify just by looking around us, then what else did they lie about? What other truths did they invert? What other realities did they manufacture?" The question hung in the darkness, unanswerable and terrible. Because once you started pulling that thread, Once you began questioning one pillar of the propaganda, the whole structure became unstable. If they'd lied about America's weakness, had they also lied about the necessity of the war, about Germany's righteousness, about the threats that supposedly justified 5 years of total mobilization and sacrifice? Dietrich didn't answer, couldn't answer. The questions were too big, the implications too vast. His entire adult life had been shaped by the war, by the narrative that Germany was fighting for survival against enemies who wanted to destroy it. If that narrative was false, if Germany had been the aggressor all along pursuing conquest rather than defending itself, then what did that make him? What did it make all of them? He fell asleep with those questions circling through his mind, unresolved and troubling. Outside, the Vermont winter deepened. Inside, 473 German prisoners adjusted to a new reality, one that didn't match anything they'd been prepared for. In the morning, they would begin work. They would start the process of becoming something other than pure soldiers, pure prisoners. They would begin, though none of them knew it yet, the slow transformation from enemies to something more complicated. But that night, Dietrich Brenner lay in his warm bunk with a full stomach and felt the first hairline cracks spread through everything he'd once believed about the world, about the war, and about what it meant to be on the losing side of history. Tomorrow would bring bacon and eggs for breakfast. Real eggs, real bacon. The kind of meal that would have been luxurious in peacetime Germany, impossibly rich for a prisoner of war, and it would be served without ceremony, without fanfare, as if feeding prisoners well was simply the natural order of things. That casual abundance, that unthinking generosity would prove more devastating to German certainties than any amount of harsh treatment could have been. Because it's easy to hate an enemy who confirms your worst beliefs about them. Far harder to hate one who shows you grace you don't deserve, kindness you haven't earned, and in doing so forces you to question whether you ever understood the conflict at all. The following Monday morning arrived cold and crystalline, the kind of December day where breath froze in the air and every sound carried sharp and clear across the snow. Dietrich stood with the other prisoners in the central yard while a sergeant read out work assignments from a clipboard, his voice flat and bureaucratic, translating each assignment into German with the help of an interpreter. When his name was called, Dietrich stepped forward along with Wilhelm Lucas and 5 other men. They were assigned to a dairy farm 3 miles from camp, owned by a man named Harlan Gallagher. The guards loaded them onto the back of a truck, and they rode through the morning cold, watching their breath turn to fog, watching the Vermont landscape pass in shades of white and grey and the deep green of pine forests. The Gallagher farm appeared gradually as they rounded a curve in the road. A substantial white farmhouse with black shutters, a massive barn that dwarfed the house painted red with white trim, its roof heavy with snow. Smaller outbuildings scattered across the property, a chicken coop, a tool shed, a covered area for equipment. Fencing that ran straight and well-maintained across fields that sloped gently toward a line of trees. Even in winter, even under snow, the farm radiated competence and prosperity. The truck stopped in the yard between the house and barn. A man emerged from the barn, pausing to pull on heavy work gloves as he approached. He was in his early 60s, Dietrich guessed, with the kind of weathered face that came from decades of outdoor work. Tall and lean, moving with the deliberate economy of someone who'd learned not to waste motion. He wore canvas work pants, a thick wool shirt, and a vest lined with sheepskin. Corporal Ezra Walsh, their guard and translator, climbed down from the truck's cab and exchanged words with the farmer. The conversation was brief, punctuated by nods. Then Walsh turned to the assembled prisoners and spoke in his careful, practiced German. "This is Mr. Harlan Gallagher. He says you look like you know which end of a cow to milk." Walsh paused, allowing himself a small smile. "He wants to know if any of you have farm experience." Dietrich raised his hand. So did 3 others, including Wilhelm. Lucas, city-born and city-raised, kept his hands at his sides, but his expression was eager. Whatever the work entailed, it had to be better than sitting in the camp all day with nothing to do but think. Harlan studied the men who'd raised their hands, his gaze moving from face to face with the assessing quality of someone used to judging livestock and hiring hands. When his eyes reached Dietrich, they lingered for a moment. Some quality in Dietrich's posture or expression seemed to satisfy him because he nodded once and gestured toward the barn. The barn interior was dim and warm, heated by the bodies of 43 dairy cows and insulated by the sweet-smelling hay stacked in the loft above. The smell hit Dietrich immediately, manure and milk and hay and the particular musk of cattle in winter. It was a smell that bypassed his conscious mind and went straight to memory, to Bavaria, to helping his neighbor Otto during harvest season, to early mornings in the barn before school, to a time when the world made sense and the future seemed knowable. Harlan demonstrated what he wanted done, his movements practiced and efficient. He showed them how he preferred the milking done, the rhythm and pressure that kept the cows calm and productive. Showed them where to store the full pails, how to move between the stalls without spooking the animals, the signs that indicated a cow might be sick or injured. He spoke in English throughout, with Walsh translating the key points, but much of it was self-evident. Cows were cows, whether in Vermont or Bavaria. The work was the work. They fell into the routine. Dietrich found himself at the third stall from the door, settling onto a low stool beside a brown and white Holstein, who regarded him with liquid indifference. His hands remembered the motion, the alternating pressure, the angle, the rhythm that matched the cow's own breathing. The milk hissed into the pail in steady streams, and Dietrich felt something in his chest unclench slightly. This was familiar. This was real work that produced real results. There was a comfort in that, a sense of purpose that had been absent from his life since the capture. Wilhelm worked 2 stalls over his movements, slower and more careful, adjusting for the stiffness in his leg. Lucas struggled at first, earning a few irritated kicks from his assigned cow, but Harlan came over and demonstrated again with patient gestures until the boy got the hang of it. They worked through the morning as winter light strengthened and then began its early decline toward afternoon. The physical labor was demanding but not excessive. Harlan was exacting but fair, correcting mistakes without anger, acknowledging good work with brief nods. By noon, Dietrich's shoulders ached in a way that felt earned rather than imposed. He was tired, but it was the good tiredness of honest work, not the grinding exhaustion of forced labor or combat. Then Harlan did something unexpected. He gestured for them to follow him, not back to the truck where Walsh waited, but toward the farmhouse. Walsh seemed surprised, but translated Harlan's words. "Mr. Gallagher says you'll take lunch in the house. His wife has prepared food." The prisoners exchanged uncertain glances. Dietrich had assumed they'd eat whatever rations Walsh had brought in the truck. The idea of being invited into the farmer's home, of sitting at his table, seemed impossible. They were prisoners. The enemy. You didn't invite the enemy into your home for lunch. But Harlan was already walking toward the house, clearly expecting them to follow. After a moment's hesitation, they did. The kitchen was everything the barn was not bright, where the barn was dim, warm from a wood stove that radiated heat into every corner, filled with the smells of cooking rather than animals. A large table dominated the center of the room, covered with a red and white checkered cloth. Windows looked out over the snowy fields, letting in the pale winter light. A woman stood at the stove, stirring something in a large pot. She turned when they entered, and Dietrich saw a face that was kind but worn, showing the same weather-beaten quality as her husband's. She wore a simple house dress covered by an apron, her grey hair pulled back in a practical bun. When she smiled at them, the expression was genuine, reaching her eyes despite whatever reservations she might have felt about feeding German soldiers in her kitchen. Harlan said something to her in English, and she nodded, gesturing for them to sit. The prisoners hesitated, acutely aware of their work-stained clothes, their status, the strangeness of the situation. But Sarah Gallagher Walsh, provided her name, was already moving around the table, setting out bowls and plates with brisk efficiency. They sat awkwardly, Dietrich finding himself at one end of the table, with Wilhelm beside him. The wood chairs were solid and well-made, the kind of furniture that lasted generations. On the wall above the sideboard, Dietrich noticed photographs in simple frames. 2 young men in army uniforms, their faces serious for the camera caps at regulation angles. The family resemblance to Harlan was clear in their jawlines, in the set of their shoulders. Sarah brought the food. Thick sandwiches made with ham that had been sliced, generous real cheese that hadn't come from a can, bread so fresh it was still slightly warm. Hot vegetable soup carried to the table in a ceramic tureen, ladled into bowls that steamed and sent up scents of beef broth and winter vegetables. A plate of cookies, actual cookies made with real sugar and butter, the kind of luxury that had disappeared from German tables years ago. Harlan took his seat at the head of the table. He bowed his head briefly, lips moving in what was clearly a prayer, though he spoke too quietly for anyone to hear the words. Then he picked up his spoon and began eating, and that simple action gave the prisoners permission to do the same. Dietrich bit into his sandwich, and the flavors hit him like the previous night's dinner had, overwhelming in their richness, shocking in their abundance. The ham was salty and smoky, tasting of prosperity and plenty. The cheese was sharp and real, melting slightly from the warmth of the fresh bread. The bread itself had that perfect texture of a well-made loaf, soft interior with just enough structure to hold together crust that gave way with a satisfying resistance. He had to close his eyes for a moment, had to process the sensation of eating food prepared not in an institutional kitchen by cooks feeding hundreds, but in a home kitchen by someone who cared about how it tasted. There was a fundamental difference, he realized. This food was made with intention, with care, as an act of hospitality rather than obligation. The soup was even better. Each spoonful carried chunks of carrot and potato and celery, vegetables that had come from the Gallagher's own garden, probably preserved from the fall harvest. They swam in beef broth so rich it left a sheen of fat on Dietrich's lips. The warmth spread through his chest as he swallowed not just physical warmth, but something else. Something that felt dangerously close to being cared for. Sarah moved around the table with practiced efficiency, refilling bowls before they were quite empty, offering seconds on sandwiches, her hands never still. She spoke to them in English, her tone warm and encouraging, even though they couldn't understand the words. Walsh translated occasionally, but mostly the meal passed in comfortable silence, broken only by the sounds of eating and the occasional scrape of spoons on bowls. Dietrich found his gaze drawn again to the photographs on the wall. The two young men in uniform. Sarah caught him looking and said something in English, her voice softening. Walsh translated. "Those are her sons, Michael and David, both serving overseas." The words hit Dietrich like cold water. He set down his spoon carefully, his appetite suddenly complicated by understanding. These people were feeding them German soldiers, prisoners of war, while their own sons were somewhere in Europe, possibly fighting against German forces at this very moment. Their sons might be in the path of German artillery, might be facing German machine guns, might be even now dying because of men like Dietrich. And yet here sat Sarah Gallagher, offering him cookies and more soup, treating him with a kindness he didn't deserve and couldn't comprehend. Wilhelm had noticed the photographs too. He leaned close and whispered in German, his voice barely audible. "Why would they do this, feed us, when their children are fighting our army?" Dietrich had no answer. The logic of it escaped him entirely. In Germany, he'd seen how enemy prisoners were treated, not with cruelty necessarily, but with cold efficiency. They were given what the Geneva Convention required, and nothing more. The idea of inviting them into your home, of your wife baking cookies for them while your sons were at war, would have seemed insane. Yet here it was happening, real and undeniable. Sarah brought out apple pie, the same pie they'd been served in the mess hall, but somehow it tasted different here, more personal. She cut generous slices and served them warm, and when Dietrich took the first bite, the butter crust shattering to release cinnamon sugar perfume, he felt his throat tighten with emotion he couldn't name. This wasn't just food. It was an act of radical humanity, a refusal to let the war turn people into categories and numbers. Sarah Gallagher was looking at 8 German prisoners and choosing to see 8 young men far from home, 8 sons that someone else was missing, 8 human beings who deserved to be fed well, even if they wore the wrong uniform. The knowledge of that grace hurt worse than any punishment could have. Because punishment, he could understand. Punishment made sense. But this kindness, this unearned and undeserved compassion, it undermined everything he'd been taught about how the world worked, about the nature of enemies and allies, about what people did to each other in wartime. When the meal ended, Harlan stood and spoke a few words in English. Walsh translated. "Mr. Gallagher thanks you for your work this morning. He says you did good. He'll see you tomorrow." They filed out of the warm kitchen back into the December cold, but Dietrich felt the warmth of that meal staying with him, radiating from his full stomach outward. As they climbed into the truck for the ride back to camp, he caught Wilhelm's eye. The older man's expression was troubled, his usual composure cracked by the same confusion Dietrich felt. Wilhelm opened his mouth as if to speak, then seemed to think better of it. What could you say? How could you articulate the way everything you'd believed about the enemy was being systematically dismantled by simple acts of human decency? The truck pulled away from the Gallagher farm, and Dietrich turned to watch it recede through the rear window. The white farmhouse, the red barn, the fields stretching away toward the tree line, and somewhere inside that house, photographs of two young men who might not come home while their parents fed the prisoners and called it Christian duty. That night in the barracks, Dietrich lay in his bunk and tried to write a letter to his mother. He wanted to explain what he was experiencing, the cognitive dissonance of being treated well by people who had every reason to hate him. But the words wouldn't come. How could he describe this without sounding like he'd lost his mind? How could he make her understand that the enemy wasn't what they'd been told? In the end, he wrote only simple facts. He was healthy. The camp was adequate. He was working on a farm which reminded him of helping Herr Otto back home. He hoped she and father were well. He thought of them every day. The censors would read it on both sides and find nothing objectionable. Just a dutiful son writing to his mother. The truth, the real truth about what was happening to his understanding of the world that would have to wait for another time, another circumstance. If such a time ever came. Above him, Wilhelm shifted in his bunk. Then his voice came quiet in the darkness. "I've been thinking about what the sergeant said, about following orders, about how soldiers aren't responsible for the wars their leaders start." Dietrich waited, knowing there was more. "But if that's true," Wilhelm continued, "if we're not responsible for starting this war, then neither are they. Those American boys in the photographs, they're just following orders too, fighting because their country asked them to, same as we did." The thought settled into Dietrich's mind like a seed in dark soil, finding purchase, beginning to grow. "Then who's responsible?" he asked quietly. Wilhelm's answer was a long time coming. When it finally did, it was barely a whisper. "I think we both know the answer to that. We've just been too afraid to say it out loud." They lay in silence after that, two men confronting truths they'd spent years avoiding, beginning the slow, painful process of understanding that everything they'd fought for had been built on lies. Outside, the Vermont winter deepened. Tomorrow they would return to the Gallagher farm. They would milk the cows and mend fences and do whatever work needed doing. And slowly, without quite realizing it was happening, they would begin the transformation from prisoners to something else. Something that didn't have a name yet, but felt like the first stirrings of redemption. The weeks folded into each other with a rhythm that felt almost peaceful. Wake before dawn in the heated barracks. Black coffee and porridge in the mess hall, sometimes with bacon and eggs that still seemed impossibly luxurious. The truck ride through the frozen Vermont landscape to the Gallagher farm. 6 hours of honest work that left muscles aching but minds quiet. Lunch in the warm kitchen where Sarah Gallagher treated them like hired hands instead of prisoners. More work in the afternoon. The ride back to camp as winter darkness fell early over the mountains. Dinner, letters written by lamplight, sleep. It was the kind of routine that could lull you into forgetting you were a prisoner at all, except for the guards, except for the wire fence, except for the knowledge that somewhere across the ocean The war was still consuming lives and cities, still grinding forward towards some inevitable conclusion that grew clearer with each passing week. January brought deeper cold and heavier snow. The work at the Gallagher farm shifted to winter maintenance, repairing equipment, reinforcing the barn against the cold, cutting firewood from the forest that bordered the property. Dietrich found satisfaction in the physical labor, in tasks that had clear beginnings and endings that produced visible results. There was something healing about swinging an axe into wood, about the clean split and the smell of fresh-cut pine, about stacking the split logs in neat rows that would keep the farmhouse warm through the rest of winter. Harlan worked alongside them most days, his presence a steady constant. He didn't talk much, but he taught through demonstration and correction, and Dietrich learned to read his expressions. A slight nod meant approval. A hand gesture indicated a better way to approach a task. The rare smile, usually directed at a job well done, felt like a small victory. The letters from home grew more desperate. In late January, Dietrich received a response from his mother that had taken 4 months to arrive. The censors had blacked out entire paragraphs, but the message that remained was clear enough. Food was very scarce. The bombing was constant. His father's hands had been injured, she didn't say how, and he could no longer work the ovens, even if there had been flour to bake with. They were managing, she insisted, but the subtext was obvious. They were surviving day to day, never certain if there would be a next day, slowly losing the battle against hunger and cold, and the systematic destruction of everything they'd known. Dietrich sat on his bunk and read the letter 3 times, and each time the contrast grew sharper. His mother was starving while he ate beef stew and apple pie. His father's hands were damaged while Dietrich's grew stronger from farm work. They huddled in a city being pulverized by bombs while he slept warm and safe in the Vermont mountains. The guilt was a constant weight, but beneath it ran something else, something that felt like understanding. This war that had been sold to them as necessary as defensive as Germany's righteous struggle against enemies who wanted to destroy it, this war was destroying Germany, not the enemies. Germany itself, through choices its leaders had made, through aggression disguised as defense, through lies that had led an entire nation into catastrophe. And the people paying the price weren't the leaders. They were his mother and father, Sarah and Harlan Gallagher's sons. The young men in both uniforms dying in snow and mud and fire because old men had chosen war over wisdom. February arrived with a thaw that turned the roads to mud and then froze them solid again at night. At the camp, the YMCA sent another shipment this time, including books in German musical instruments and sports equipment. An orchestra formed among the prisoners, men who'd been teachers and clerks and farmers, discovering they could make music together. On Sunday evenings, they gave concerts in the mess hall, and the guards would sometimes stand at the back and listen their faces, showing the universal human response to beauty created in difficult circumstances. Lucas, who'd arrived full of bravado and talk of escape, had undergone his own transformation. He'd become fascinated by baseball after one of the guards showed him how to read the sports pages in the camp's English newspapers. Now he peppered Corporal Walsh with questions about batting averages and pitching strategies, his enthusiasm transcending the language barrier. The guard seemed to find it endearing, this German kid who wanted to understand America through its national pastime. One evening, as they sat in the barracks after dinner, Lucas looked up from a newspaper Walsh had given him and spoke with an earnestness that was new. His earlier cynicism burned away. "I was wrong," he said quietly. "About the torture camps, about them wanting us dead. I was so certain, and I was completely wrong." Wilhelm, reading a book by lamplight, looked up over his glasses. "It takes courage to admit that." "No." Lucas shook his head. "Courage is admitting it when there are consequences. Here, the only consequence is understanding the truth. That's not courage. That's just finally seeing what was in front of me all along." Dietrich said nothing, but he felt a kinship with the boy in that moment. They were all going through the same process, just at different speeds. The dismantling of certainty, the reconstruction of understanding, the painful acknowledgement that they'd been willing participants in something monstrous because they'd believed the lies their leaders told them. March brought the first hints of spring. The snow began to retreat from the southern-facing slopes. Birds returned. The days lengthened. And then, on a morning that started like any other, everything changed. They were in the Gallagher barn, finishing the morning milking, when they heard a vehicle pull into the yard. Unusual, because deliveries and visits typically came in the afternoon. Dietrich was wiping down the last stall when he heard Harlan's voice from outside, raised in a way he'd never heard before. Not angry. Something worse. Something that sounded like the world breaking. He moved to the barn door and looked out. A young man in a Western Union uniform stood beside a bicycle holding out a yellow envelope. Harlan took it with hands that Dietrich could see shaking even from a distance. He opened it there in the yard, read it, and then sat down heavily on the running board of his truck, as if his legs had simply stopped working. Sarah came running from the house, her apron still on flour, dusting her hands. She saw the telegram in Harlan's grip, and her face went white. She took it from him, read it, and pressed one hand over her mouth. The sound she made a keening note of grief that needed no translation carried across the cold morning air and into the barn where 8 German prisoners stood frozen. Corporal Walsh, who'd been checking the truck's oil, went to them, spoke quietly, listened. Then he straightened and turned toward the barn, his young face aged by what he'd just learned. He walked to where the prisoners stood and spoke in his careful German, each word dropping like a stone into still water. Their youngest son, Private Michael Gallagher, killed in action in Germany 2 weeks ago, March 3rd. The barn fell into a silence so complete that Dietrich could hear his own heartbeat, could hear Wilhelm's sharp intake of breath beside him, could hear Lucas whisper something that might have been a prayer or might have been a curse. They were standing in the barn of a man whose son had just been killed by German forces, wearing German uniforms, fed by German hands, and they had been eating this man's food, sleeping warm and safe, while his son died fighting people who wore the same uniform Dietrich had worn, who spoke the same language, who came from the same homeland. The logic was inescapable and terrible. They were the enemy, not abstractly, not in propaganda terms, but concretely and personally. One of them might have been in the unit that killed Michael Gallagher. One of them might have fired the shot, thrown the grenade, called in the artillery strike. Even if they personally were innocent, they were part of the machine that had killed this man's son. Dietrich waited for the rage, for Harlan to storm into the barn and order them off his property, for Sarah to appear with accusations and grief-fueled hatred. It would be deserved, it would be natural, it would be the only reasonable response to what they represented. But long minutes passed, and nothing happened. Finally, Corporal Walsh spoke again, his voice rough with emotion. Mr. Gallagher asks that you return to camp for the rest of the day, out of respect for his family's grief. They moved toward the truck in stunned silence, but before they could climb in, Harlan stood up from the running board. He walked toward them with slow, deliberate steps, and Dietrich felt his chest tighten with anticipation of what was coming. The condemnation they deserved, the hatred they'd earned. Harlan stopped 3 feet away. His eyes were red but dry. His face showed the kind of control that came from years of farming, of dealing with loss and hardship, and the casual cruelties of weather and fate. When he spoke, his voice was steady, and Walsh translated sentence by sentence. "It's not your fault." The words made no sense. Dietrich's brain refused to process them. It had to be a mistranslation. Had to be Walsh getting the English wrong, because the statement was impossible. How could it not be their fault? They were German soldiers. Michael Gallagher had been killed by German soldiers. The connection was direct and undeniable. But Harlan was still speaking and Walsh was still translating. My son knew what he was fighting for. He knew the risks. Michael wouldn't want me to take my anger out on you. You're just young men who got caught up in something bigger than yourselves, same as he was. This war, it's not about you and me. It's about old men making terrible decisions and young men paying the price. He paused, and something that might have been grief or might have been exhaustion crossed his face. I need you to leave now. Not because I hate you, because I need to be with my wife and we need time to grieve. But this isn't your fault. You didn't kill my son. The war killed my son. You understand the difference." Dietrich wanted to speak, to say something that would acknowledge the impossible grace of what Harlan was offering, but his throat had closed up entirely. All he could manage was a nod. They climbed into the truck and rode back to camp in absolute silence. The Vermont landscape passed outside the windows, mountains and forests, and the first green hints of spring, but Dietrich saw none of it. He was trapped in his own mind, trying to process what had just happened, trying to understand how a man whose son had just been killed could separate the individual from the system, could look at enemy soldiers and refuse to see enemies. That evening, Dietrich tried to write a letter to his mother, tried to explain what he'd witnessed. The words came slowly, heavy with the weight of what he was trying to express. "Mutter, today I witnessed something I cannot fully explain. A man whose son was killed by our army showed us mercy. He separated us as individuals from the war that took his child. He said it was not our fault. I am beginning to understand that everything we were taught was a lie, not just about America's weakness, but about the very nature of humanity. These people, these Americans we were told to hate, they see us as human beings first and enemies second. I don't know what this means for everything I believed, everything I fought for. But I know that I am being shown a kind of grace I never knew existed, and it is changing me in ways I cannot yet name." He knew the censors would read it, might black out entire paragraphs, might never let it reach his mother at all. But he had to try to articulate the transformation happening inside him, had to put into words the slow dissolution of everything he'd once been certain about. The next day, they did not go to the Gallagher farm, or the day after that. For a full week they were reassigned to other duties, working in the camp's own small agricultural plots, repairing equipment, helping with general maintenance. Walsh explained that the Gallaghers needed time, that grief had its own requirements. But on the Monday of the second week, the truck appeared in the morning to take them back to the farm. Walsh offered no explanation, just gestured for them to climb in. They rode in nervous silence, none of them certain what they would find, whether Harlan had changed his mind, whether the initial grace would prove temporary once the shock of grief wore off. The farm looked the same, the white house, the red barn, the fields still patched with snow, but showing more green each day. Harlan emerged from the barn as they pulled up, and his face showed the marks of grief, new lines around his eyes, a heaviness in his movements, but when he looked at them, his expression held no hatred. He gestured toward the barn. Work was waiting. Life continued even in the presence of death. They fell back into the routine, but everything was different now. The work felt heavier with meaning. Each task they completed, each fence they mended, each animal they tended, it felt like a kind of penance, an attempt to honor the impossible kindness they'd been shown. Sarah appeared at midday with lunch as she always had. But this time, when she set the food on the table in the barn's small office, rather than inviting them into the house, Dietrich understood. Some intimacies were too much to maintain in the face of loss. Some boundaries needed to be redrawn. And that was reasonable. That was human. What amazed him was that she came at all, that she continued to prepare food for them to ensure they were fed well, even while wearing black for her son. After they ate, Dietrich approached Harlan, where he was repairing a section of fence. He'd practiced the words in his head, worked with Walsh to get the English pronunciation right. His accent was terrible, and his grammar probably worse, but he needed to say this in Harlan's own language. "I am sorry. For your son. I am very sorry." Harlan looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded once, and something in his expression softened. "I know you are, son. I can see it in how you work, in how you carry yourself. You're a good man caught in a bad situation." My Michael. He understood that. He wrote to us about German prisoners he'd seen. Said most of them looked scared and young and not much different from our boys. Said the real evil wasn't in the soldiers on either side, but in the men who started this whole damn mess. He paused, and Dietrich saw grief crack through the controlled exterior for just a moment. "My son saw your humanity even when you were shooting at him. Least I can do is honor that by seeing it now." The words lodged in Dietrich's chest like shrapnel, painful and impossible to remove. This man's son had died seeing the humanity in his enemies, And now the father was extending the same grace to the actual enemy standing in front of him. It was too much, too heavy to carry, too profound to fully understand. But Dietrich felt it settling into him anyway, changing the fundamental architecture of who he was. The weeks that followed took on a different quality. The work continued, the routine held. But now there was an understanding between the German prisoners and the Vermont farmer that went beyond employer and employees beyond captor and captive. They were bound together by grief and grace, by loss, and the refusal to let loss breed more hatred. April brought undeniable spring. The snow retreated to the highest peaks. Mud season turned the roads into challenges. And then the news came that everyone had been both expecting and dreading. President Roosevelt was dead. The announcement rippled through the camp with strange effect. The American guards were visibly shaken, many openly grieving for a leader who'd guided them through depression and war. What struck Dietrich was the genuineness of the emotion. These men weren't performing grief because it was required. They felt it, deeply and personally. He thought about German leadership, about the forced displays of devotion, the mandatory enthusiasm, the way public emotion was choreographed and demanded. About how different that was from what he was witnessing now, real grief for a real loss freely expressed, because the feeling was authentic. Wilhelm, standing beside him as they listened to the radio broadcast announcing Roosevelt's death, spoke quietly in German. This is what real leadership looks like. People mourning not because they're forced to, but because they've lost someone who actually served them, who they chose, who they trusted, who earned their respect, rather than demanded it through fear. The observation was dangerous even here, even among fellow prisoners. But it was also undeniably true. And the truth of it was one more brick removed from the wall of certainty that had once defined Dietrich's understanding of the world. May arrived with genuine warmth. The farm work shifted to spring planting. Dietrich found himself operating equipment he'd never seen before, learning American methods of agriculture that were more mechanized, more efficient than what he'd known in Bavaria. Harlan was a patient teacher, showing him how to handle the tractor, how to judge planting depth and spacing, how to read the soil and weather for optimal conditions. They were working in the far field one afternoon when Harlan shut off the tractor and gestured for Dietrich to join him. They stood at the fence line, looking out over the planted rows, the mountains rising in the distance, the sky impossibly blue. Harlan spoke in English, and Corporal Walsh, always nearby now, his role having evolved from guard to translator to something like facilitator, rendered it into German. "I've been thinking," Harlan said, his voice measured, "about what happens when this war ends, about what you boys will do, whether they'll send you back to Germany." He paused, and Dietrich waited, uncertain where this was leading. "The thing is," Harlan continued, "I'm not getting any younger. This farm, it's a lot of work, and with Michael gone—" His voice caught slightly, but he pushed through. "With Michael gone, I'm down a son who I'd hoped would take over someday. David, my older boy, he wants to be an engineer. Never took to farming the way Michael did." He turned to look directly at Dietrich. "You're a good worker, honest, careful. You understand animals and land. So here's what I'm thinking. When this war ends officially and they start releasing you boys if you want, there's a job here. Not as a prisoner, as a hired man, fair wages, room in the barn until you get on your feet. You could make a life here if that's something you'd want." The offer hung in the spring air, impossible and perfect and terrifying all at once. Dietrich's mind raced through implications. Stay in America. Leave Germany behind. Build a life in the country that had been his enemy. Work for a man whose son his countrymen had killed. Make a home in the place where he'd been a prisoner. "I know it's a lot to think about," Harlan said, misreading Dietrich's silence as hesitation. "You don't have to answer now. Just wanted you to know the offer's there. You've earned it with your work, and more than that, you've earned it with how you've conducted yourself, with your character." That night, lying in his bunk, Dietrich thought about the offer. Thought about his parents in Munich, if they were even still alive. thought about a Germany he could barely remember, a country that existed now only in ruins and ash. Thought about the Gallagher farm, the mountains, the honest work, and the impossible grace he'd been shown. For the first time since his capture, he allowed himself to imagine a future beyond the war. And in that imagined future, he saw himself not in Bavaria, but in Vermont. Not rebuilding what had been destroyed, but building something new from the ground up. The war in Europe ended on May 8th. The news came over the radio in the mess hall, and the American guards erupted in celebration while the German prisoners sat in complicated silence. Relief that the killing was over, sadness for all that had been lost, anxiety about what came next, shame for what their nation had done, what they'd been part of, even if unwillingly. Colonel Morrison addressed them the next day, his message translated carefully. "The war is over, but your imprisonment is not. Germany is in chaos. There's no functioning government to repatriate you, to no system in place to receive you. You'll remain here until arrangements can be made. For some of you that may be months, for others possibly longer. I know this is difficult news, but I promise you'll continue to be treated fairly according to the conventions of war." Months. Possibly longer. Dietrich felt no disappointment at the news, only a strange relief. He wasn't ready to leave, wasn't ready to face what Germany had become. Maybe in his heart, he was already making the choice that Harlan's offer had opened up. The summer of 1945 was both strange and settled. The war was over, but the prisoners remained existing in a liminal space between imprisonment and freedom. Some men began the process of repatriation, choosing to return to Germany despite the chaos. Others, like Dietrich, began exploring the possibility of staying. The work at the Gallagher farm continued through planting season, through the long Vermont summer, with its intense growing period. Dietrich's English improved daily, helped by Walsh's patient tutoring and Harlan's simple, direct speech. He learned American idioms and farming terminology. Learned to think in English for simple things, though German remained his language of emotion and complexity. In July, Sarah invited them back into the farmhouse for lunch. It felt like a threshold crossed, to return to the intimacy that grief had temporarily interrupted. She served them cold ham sandwiches and potato salad made with eggs and pickles, and a creamy dressing that Dietrich had never tasted before. For dessert, strawberry shortcake with fresh berries from her garden and whipped cream so rich it was almost obscene. They ate in the familiar kitchen, and when Dietrich's eyes found the photographs on the wall, the two young men in uniform, he saw that a black ribbon had been added to Michael's frame. But the photograph remained. A memorial, but also an acknowledgement. This was who we lost. This was why we grieve. But life continues, and we honor him by continuing it with grace. August brought harvest. The work intensified, long days in the fields, bringing in hay, preparing for fall planting. Dietrich felt his body change, growing stronger and more capable. He'd gained weight since arriving, probably 35 pounds, though they no longer weighed prisoners regularly. His face had filled out. His arms and shoulders carried real muscle, now built by honest work rather than military training. He was becoming someone new. Dietrich, the German soldier, was fading. Dietrich, the American farmer, was emerging, still uncertain, still tentative, but undeniably present. In September, his application to remain in the United States was approved. The paperwork came through with surprising speed, helped by Harlan's letter of support and the recommendation of Colonel Morrison, who'd observed Dietrich's conduct throughout his imprisonment. He was released from prisoner status on a cool September morning, walked out of Camp Waterbury as a free man, or at least a man no longer imprisoned, and directly into Harlan Gallagher's employment. $45 a month, plus room and board. It was less than an American farmhand would make, but it was honest wages for honest work, and it was more money than Dietrich had seen in years. He moved into the small apartment above the barn that Harlan had prepared. Simple but comfortable, with a wood stove and a real bed and windows that looked out over the farm toward the mountains. His first night there, lying in bed in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the farm settling around him. Dietrich felt something he hadn't experienced in longer than he could remember. Peace. Not happiness exactly. There was still too much grief, too much guilt, too much unprocessed trauma for simple happiness. But peace. The sense that he was where he was supposed to be doing work that mattered among people who'd shown him grace he'd never stopped trying to deserve. The years that followed were a gradual integration, learning English fluently, adapting to American customs and expectations, dealing with occasional hostility from townspeople who couldn't forget he'd been the enemy, but mostly finding acceptance helped by the Gallagher's vouching and his own quiet competence. In 1948, he married Margaret, a schoolteacher from the next town over, who'd been intrigued by the German farmhand, who spoke carefully and worked hard and treated everyone with gentle respect. She was the daughter of another farmer, understood the rhythms of agricultural life, and wasn't bothered by Dietrich's past. Or rather, she was bothered by what the war had done to everyone involved, but she saw Dietrich as another victim of it, rather than a perpetrator. Their wedding was small, held in the Lutheran church with Reverend Schmidt presiding. The Gallaghers sat in the front row, Sarah crying happy tears, Harlan's presence a steady anchor. Wilhelm Hartmann, who'd stayed and found work teaching at the local school, served as best man. It felt like the final crossing of a threshold. Dietrich Brenner was no longer a German prisoner in America. He was an American building, an American life, part of an American community. In 1952, their first child was born, a son. When Harlan visited the hospital and asked what they'd name him, Dietrich answered without hesitation, "Michael, if that's acceptable to you and Sarah." Harlan had to turn away for a moment, his shoulders shaking. When he turned back, his eyes were wet, but his voice was steady. "It's more than acceptable. It's an honor. To Michael's memory and to the man you've become." The farm prospered under Dietrich's management. In 1962, when Harlan decided to retire, he sold the farm to Dietrich on generous terms, a fair price with a payment plan that Dietrich could actually manage. The transfer of ownership happened at the town clerk's office, a simple legal transaction that carried enormous weight. Dietrich Brenner, former enemy prisoner of war, was now the owner of the farm where he'd once worked as a captive. The land that had transformed him was now his to care for, his to pass on to the next generation. David Gallagher, the older son who'd survived the war and become an engineer as planned, made the trip from Boston for the transfer ceremony. He shook Dietrich's hand firmly and said what his father was too emotional to articulate. Michael would have approved. He always saw people for who they were, not where they came from. You taking over this farm, keeping it alive, there's no better memorial to my brother than that. The decades passed. Children grew. The farm evolved with new methods and equipment, but maintained its essential character. Dietrich became a respected member of the community town selectmen for 3 terms, volunteer firefighter, church deacon. He never hid his past, but he didn't dwell on it either. It was simply part of his story, the dark chapter that led to transformation. In the 1990s, the local high school started a program where veterans and others with wartime experience would speak to students about their experiences. When they invited Dietrich, he almost declined. What did he have to say that wouldn't sound like making excuses or seeking sympathy? But Margaret encouraged him. Your story isn't about making excuses. It's about grace, about how people can choose kindness even when they have every right to choose hate. The kids need to hear that. So he went, stood in front of a classroom full of teenagers and told them about arriving in Vermont expecting death, about the bacon and eggs that shattered his beliefs about American weakness, about Harlan Gallagher saying, "It's not your fault," when he had every right to say something very different, about the slow transformation from prisoner to citizen, from enemy to neighbor. He told them about the price of believing propaganda, about the importance of questioning authority, about the courage it takes to admit you were wrong, to change your mind to become someone new when everything you believed turns out to be false. When he finished, the classroom was silent. Then a girl in the front row raised her hand. "Mr. Brenner, do you think you deserved the kindness they showed you?" He considered the question carefully before answering. "No, I didn't deserve it. That's the whole point of grace, it's not earned." Mr. Gallagher didn't feed me because I deserved it. He fed me because that's who he was, because he chose to see me as a human being first and an enemy second. And that choice, that refusal to let hate dictate his actions, it changed everything. It changed me, made me want to become someone worthy of that grace, even though I could never truly earn it. The students sat with that for a moment. Then the teacher, a woman in her 50s who'd been watching from the back of the room, spoke up. "Class, what Mr. Brenner is describing, this is the best of what America can be. Not perfect, not without flaws, but capable of grace even in the darkest times. Remember this story when you're tempted to hate people because of where they're from or what they believe. Remember that the man in front of you was once our enemy, and now he's our neighbor, our friend, our fellow American. That transformation was possible because someone chose kindness over revenge." Dietrich left the school that day, feeling lighter than he had in years. His story had meaning beyond himself. It could teach something essential about human nature, about the choices that define us, about the possibility of redemption. In 2003, at the age of 82, Dietrich Brenner died peacefully in his sleep. He was surrounded by his children, grandchildren and great-grandchildren Americans, all carrying forward the life he'd built from the ashes of his old one. At his funeral, the church was packed. Farmers and shopkeepers and teachers, people he'd known for 50 years and young people who'd only heard the stories. The pastor read from a letter Dietrich had written to be opened after his death. "To whoever reads this, I came to Vermont as an enemy and left as a friend. I came expecting death and found life. I came certain of my beliefs and had them shattered by simple acts of human kindness. The real victory of the war wasn't military. It was moral. It was Harlan Gallagher saying, 'It's not your fault,' when his heart was breaking. It was Sarah Gallagher feeding me cookies while grieving her son. It was Americans seeing past the uniform to the man underneath. That grace transformed me from prisoner to citizen, from enemy to neighbor. I tried every day to deserve it, knowing I never fully could. If my life means anything, let it mean this grace freely given has the power to transform the world, one person at a time, one choice at a time, one act of unexpected kindness at a time. That's how we overcome war. That's how we become human again." The pastor folded the letter carefully and looked out over the assembled mourners. Dietrich Brenner arrived in Vermont 70 years ago as prisoner number 4742. He left this world as a beloved father, grandfather, friend, and member of this community. His transformation from one to the other is a testament to the best of what we can be when we choose grace over revenge, understanding over hate, the future over the past. Camp Waterbury was gone, torn down in 1946 and reclaimed by forest. Few physical traces remained of the place that had housed 473 German prisoners. But the legacy persisted, in the stories told to grandchildren, in the friendships that had endured across decades, in the quiet grace of a farmer who'd chosen to see the human beneath the enemy uniform, and in the farm that Dietrich had tended for 60 years, now run by his son Michael and grandson Harlan, the cycle complete, the transformation absolute. 473 German prisoners arrived in Vermont expecting death. Dietrich Brenner arrived expecting the worst of humanity and discovered the best. He came as an enemy and stayed as a son. That transformation from prisoner to citizen, from hate to understanding, from war to peace, began with a simple meal and a simple choice to treat the enemy with human dignity. It was completed over decades of honest work, of slowly earning acceptance, of building a life worthy of the grace he'd been shown. And it persisted long after his death, in the land he'd cared for, the family he'd raised, the community he'd served, and the story he'd left behind. A story about how grace, freely given to those who don't deserve it, has the power to transform not just individuals, but the future itself. That was the real victory. Not defeating the enemy, but transforming them into friends. Not destroying, but building. Not hate, but grace. And it all began on a cold December morning in 1944, when a young German baker's son stepped off a ship expecting death and found instead something he could only call heaven.